everyone, and thank you for logging in. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I would like to extend my respect to the traditional owners of the land on which everyone is located today. The purpose for today is to discuss with an animated panel a few tips for outcomes measurement, what worked for them, and where to start when things are tough. Outcomes measurement is not easy. We have 1.5 hours if you decide to stay for the full session with the extended 30 minutes. And this will not be a crash course into outcomes measurement. It will not give you that silver bullet to measure outcomes or assess impact of your programs, the impact of your programs, but it will hopefully spark some ideas about what works and where you can start to measure the change you make. I'll kick off today by taking 5 minutes to bring forward a few aspects of outcomes measurement. Some of you may be well familiar with this, but I would like to reiterate and make sure we are all in the same spot as we start the conversation of outcomes measurement on a shoestring. Well, firstly, outcomes measurement is not a one-off thing. Outcomes measurement is a process that needs to be embedded in everything that an organization does. While we are often tempted to just jump into that measurement, into asking, well, what should I measure? What is the data that I need? Who should I be collecting it from? We actually need to be aware of our context. We need to understand what we work with, what problem we are looking to address, who are we working with, and who will we engage for our outcomes measurement. So those are the points 1 and 2 that we represented here in this wheel for outcomes measurement. Then we need to understand the program that we work with and your organization and how that fits in your organization. And often you would have heard that you develop a theory of change and a logic model to understand that sequence between what you do and the change that you want to see. And to answer that question, well, does it make sense? Does it make sense for me to measure these outcomes or to claim these outcomes? Is it obvious from the activities that that I engage with? And once that is all clear, you have to understand what to measure. And there will be a whole suite of outcomes that you could measure. And you need to look at, well, what is measurable now? What should I be focusing on? And once you understand that, we go on to develop indicators and the measures that you'll be collecting data for. So you'll need to start collecting some data to understand who you should collect data from and when, and then go on into analyzing that data and in the end to communicate that impact. And once you get to that point, you need to understand, well, what am I doing with this? What are we doing with this with these findings that I've got? So we're putting it back into the context, and then we continue this wheel of measurement. The second point that I wanted to make is the difference between outputs and outcomes. We often see reports of number of participants or frequency of services delivered, and these are wonderful to know, but they are not outcomes. These are your outputs. They are the how many of your activities. Outcomes are the changes your activities enable the changes in attitudes, in behaviors, in conditions. They can be changes for different stakeholder groups, and they can occur at different points in time. Your theory of change will tell you when short, medium, and long-term outcomes will occur or are expected to occur, and what these outcomes are. On the other hand, the impact is the lasting systemic change to which your program contributes. We don't exist or operate in a cocoon. It takes time for impact to be achieved, and most likely a range of elements will contribute to that impact. We can demonstrate how our program contributes to impact, and it is actually rare that impact can be attributed to a single intervention. I mentioned that outcomes can be achieved for different groups of stakeholders and at different points in time. We can think of outcomes as changes in knowledge, in attitudes, in behaviors, and this often this happened at short, medium, and long term. We often see that in the short term, we would see changes in knowledge. For example, when a group of your beneficiaries engage, for example, in some training or in your program, they change knowledge about something. In the medium term, we would expect that they would do something with that knowledge, so their behavior would change. And then in the long term, we would see the results from that change behavior. We also have to think that there are different stakeholders that we engage with. And this can be at micro, meso, and macro level. So there would be this type of outcomes for all these stakeholders. And not least important, outcomes can be positive or negative and can be intended and unintended. And all of these contribute to social impact. So to be able to measure social impact, we need to account for all these groups of stakeholders across all these different points in time, and to keep an eye open for both positive and negative, to be able to really put together everything that our program affects. And my last point was going to be about challenges. And we know that we've all been here. We all face, to some extent, these challenges. And I think for the matter, we are here to discuss many of these and how to overcome them. Some of the challenges are developing a measurement of culture. This can be related to data collection, to having that systems in place, or to people, having everyone on board with measurement. Often we see them relating to resources, having the time, the money, the expertise to do outcomes measurement. We also hear from organizations having a problem of demonstrating attribution versus contribution, and thinking that, well, how can I demonstrate that I do this when there's so much more happening? So and often this is what stops some organizations from measuring, thinking that they can't demonstrate it, but there is a way around that as well. There's also the fear of failure. This is a little bit old-fashioned, thinking that what if we measure and we think that when we're not demonstrating that we're contributing, are we going to lose our funding? There needs to be that understanding that even if the findings are not positive, there's learnings from those findings, and we can use those findings to actually better our services and then outcomes for our beneficiaries. And because we often and most often, and for sure all of us engage with people, there's ethics and politics surrounding our programs and our measurement, and this may often also become a challenge. I will stop my little introduction and crash course now, and I would like to invite you to take a poll. I think that you should be able to see the poll popping up on your screen now. And please take 30 seconds to fill in to answer these 3 questions. In the meanwhile, I would like to introduce our panelists. And I might stop sharing my screen now. So in no particular order, our first panelist is Karen Wilcox. Karen has over 15 years of senior leadership and service delivery experience in the third sector. Her work has included strategic planning, research and evaluation, policy, program and team management. Karen is passionate about supporting the social sector in making a difference, and is currently undertaking her PhD at the UNSW, exploring the experiences of Australian child welfare organizations with outcomes measurement. Her PhD is close to completion. Congratulations, Karen. And this will be ready probably around 2022, early 2022. David Butkan, our second panelist, is the Executive Director at the Family Centre on the far north coast of New South Wales, and has over 30 years experience in the community services sector. David has a special interest and experience in community-led co-design, collective impact approaches, and integrated service delivery, and the Family Centre has demonstrated commitment to program outcome and social impact measurement. Last but not least, Toby Dawson is an accomplished senior manager at IRT Group with a strong background in stakeholder relationships, public relations, public health, evaluation, and social impact. He has a successful background of working with a range of diverse and disadvantaged communities, and his strength lies in finding new solutions to existing problems and engaging all relevant stakeholders to achieve a united outcome. I will now start our panel discussion. Hopefully you had the opportunity to fill in the poll. As soon as we get these responses, I will talk back about who is in the room and what those responses are across. So we'll start with our first panel question, and I'll turn for this to David. David, where should organizations with little or no experience with outcomes measurement and little or no resources start in outcomes measurement? Your microphone, David.
Unmute. Thanks for that introduction, Ioana, and welcome to everyone. Great to be here today. Look, that's a good question. I think your first slide showed a really good understanding of where it's at. I guess for me, as an experienced enthusiast in evaluation more than anything else, if I had my time over again, and the Family Centre's been doing outcome measurement for, over a dozen years now, quite some time, but and we've made a lot of mistakes. But if you were going to have some key points, 5 key areas that I would start with, and to be, again, allowing people not to make the same mistakes that we made. We didn't start this way, but we found out that this would be probably the best way if we started over. So firstly, it is about developing a theory of change and your program logics in your organisation. That's not a hard thing to do. It's quite easy. There's plenty of tips around. If you look that up on Google, I'm sure most people will be able to find that. Starting work on an evaluation plan is really important, and linking that to your theory of change and your logic models. So among other things, in a plan like that, you want to be able to answer 3 really important questions in that plan. Why you want to measure outcomes, that's going to give you a good understanding about your intent and your reasoning, understanding why you're really wanting to do this. That gives you your motivation. What outcomes you want to measure and how you're going to measure them. All really important, 3 very important questions. The third one is to consider adopting an established method or approach to evaluation and outcome measurement. Our organisation, the Family Centre, has adopted the results-based accountability framework some time ago, a model developed by Mark Friedman. Having a read of his book is a really good starting point. It's not an endorsement, but we found it a really useful guide. The results-based accountability framework gives you a really good, easy entry point to get into outcomes measurement, among other things. His book, Trying Hard is Not Good Enough, is a great starting point. Another area is investing in a data collection system or a CRM. Having a quality data collection system is going to make your life so much easier in the long term if you want to do any sort of evaluation, including outcomes measurement. That's not as easy as it sounds, and our organisation's had to develop its own data collection system over time called Chorus, but it's really important. That's one of the key areas of success in collecting data and data management. And finally, the 5th point, you really need a commitment to evaluation and outcome measurement from the leaders in your organisation. I think that's a really key point if you want to get that right from the very beginning and get the resources, get people behind you. So it's coming from the top.
Thank you. Thank you, David. That's quite insightful. So the question that arises actually from the last point that you raised there, how do you actually get the people at the top to be involved? And I might direct this question to Toby. Do you have any tips for that? Because we do hear that leadership is important. How do you get them on board?
Yeah, I think 100% when you're looking at building an outcomes measurement culture, leadership's 100% fundamental. And I think in both the work I've done at IRT Group as well as consulting, there's a consistency around the way that boards and leaderships are coming to life, or they are alive within not-for-profit sectors or for-purpose organisations, is that those boards and those leaders have been put there to bolster a lot of the financial, the risk, that sort of acumen, and they're not necessarily aware of the requirements or of the principles of social impact or outcomes measurement. So you have to slow down and understand social impact isn't a thing you do, it's not an initiative, but it's a journey over a long time. So you need to slow down and educate these leaders in social impact and those really important things. that make it come to life in your organisation. And from that experience I've had, the first starting point is actually setting up a strategy, because there's fear of the unknown. So if you can put a strategy in place, it's the guidelines for where your programs and where your energies and where your resources are going to be invested. Once you've got that strategy endorsed with leadership and they've got comfort with those programs you're doing, the next step on that journey is actually developing your logic model or theory of change, so that you can start to understand the way that they interact in driving forward your achievement of your vision or your ultimate social impact. Once you've then got that in place, the next step on that journey to bring them along to is actually looking at those outcome indicators and those measurement frameworks that can start to give you the confidence that you're delivering on your program logic, that then you can report back into delivery of that strategy. And I think that's a really important piece around outcomes measurement. Is it's not a thing you do either, but it's got a much larger purpose than giving you some data. It gives you a voice or a vehicle to communicate with your leaders. It gives you a vehicle to communicate with your clients or consumers, and also to the broader community around what your organisation is doing and what impact you're truly having. Because I think, there's the age-old maxim: if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, does it really make a sound? And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're doing outcomes measurement. It's around demonstrating what your organisation is doing and the progress that it is making.
Great. Yeah, I think you made really good points in there about this staged approach, because there is so much that we can do. And I guess I started at the beginning with, well, here is the whole cycle, and this is how you should, this is what you should embed in your organization. And then David also talked about, well, this is what we've done, and there is quite a bit. But I think that point that you're making there about that, taking it step by step, I think that does make a difference. That seems to be something that, when you're facing a big lot, you have to kind of choose, well, where do I start here?
Yeah. And I think it's because it's an unknown. The social impact industry is only, it might be further progressed internationally or globally, but it's really only evolving in Australia in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. So we're still in a state of market preparation. One of the biggest challenges for the social impact industry or the sector is that we don't have a pattern language. We don't have a consistent lexicon to talk about what we're each doing. The work that David's doing at the Family Centre is completely different to the work that IRT Group does in housing homeless older Australians, which is completely different to, say, the work of organisations like Cancer Council New South Wales. So you can't compare apples with apples. And I think the important message that I'm going to say here is, don't hold back. We have a fear of the unknown, so we're often hesitant to make that first step. But the sooner you can start to get these pieces into place, the sooner you're going to have a logic model and have some measurement data. And the data you're capturing is longitudinal data, which in my perspective is the most important data set you can ever get. So the sooner you can start capturing that, you will evolve, you will improve, you'll get better over time. But the longer you can be capturing that data, the better your communication on what you're achieving as an organisation is going to be long term.
Thank you, Toby. Yeah, that's a great point, and kind of links into the next questions that the next question that I was thinking about, and I'll direct this to Karen, because we often, and what we've talked about now, that it comes with a strategy and it flows on from there. But sometimes we see it differently, that there are already some established measures that we are being required to report against, and some frameworks that we're required to measure against. And what do we do in that situation when sometimes it feels like it's bigger than us? Is it important for organizations to adhere to these measures? Do organizations find it difficult? Is there something that you can tell us, Karen, from your research?
No, thanks, Joanna. That's actually a really good question, because it did come up in my research as quite an issue. And for a lot of organisations in particular jurisdictions as well, they are required to report outcomes to their funders around particular frameworks, or just as an acquittal requirement. So they don't have any choice but to engage in that kind of data reporting. The problem is when that's added to the work that the organisation's already doing. And this is where I think the advice of both David and Toby is really important. So where organisations are adding an outcomes collection practice to the work they're already doing with their service participants, it becomes an overload, particularly when they don't have much money and they can't really see the benefit of it because it is simply often reporting to an external source. So from my research, the organisations, even the small ones that have found this to be less arduous or burdensome, are those where they have developed an outcomes framework or an evaluation framework based on their mission or purpose and their strategic planning. And they've done those kinds of steps that, that Toby went through in terms of tying it to a theory of change. Then the reporting that they have to do, they're required to do for their funders, simply becomes part of that. So a lot of thought has to be put not just into strategy and not just into your theory of change or your reason why you're engaging in the activities or programs that you engage in, but also into how you can make your data collection processes efficient so that your staff don't burn out. And that's often means that you have to have indicators that you're already collecting. There's gold in case plan notes and case notes. There's gold in the client satisfaction surveys that a lot of organisations undertake. It's about using what you're already doing and bringing your team, frontline team members on board to understanding that turning this work into an outcomes language is actually beneficial for everyone, including the people that you're working with. And including the teams themselves. People feel really good if they know that their work is of value, especially in the social sector. There's nothing new or radical about that. We've all worked in this sector because we have a commitment to social justice. So that's not a hard thing to do. But I think there's a lot of stuff around that people can tap into. There are software as service providers. There are things you can do with Excel. Your own CRMs can often be played with in a way that you can capture your case notes as fields instead of having to write them longhand. There's a whole bunch of things that organisations can do at that data collection level, but it does require you to be more up to date on your IT and to build that literacy and skill and attachment to the process amongst the frontline teams, because their feeling of overwork in the social sector is valid. They are overworked.
And I think you're right there. You made a very valid point that people do feel sometimes maybe that is one of the challenges when asking staff to collect more data is that, well, I would rather spend my time really delivering more of my service, knowing that I'm doing good, than spending my time collecting data. And actually, I don't know exactly where this data goes and what will become of it and how it will support us. I would like to turn to Rhonda now for the poll results.
Hi there, I've just shared them. Are they coming up for you? If not, I will read them out.
Yes, I think, yes, I can see them on my screen. So we have 56% of guests here today from the not-for-profit sector. Hang on, I need to just scroll. How often do we measure outcomes? Almost half we're saying sometimes, 10% never. Then we have 27% regularly, and 15% are the lucky ones offering measuring often. And what are the main things you need internally to help support or improve the outcomes measurement? I think the top is knowledge and training. Yes, which is, I guess, what came across in our discussion so far as well. But the how-to resources are up there, internal buy-in and culture of measurement that we were just discussing now, and the leadership backing. Well, thank you for sharing this information with us. It's very valuable to know that we are, all on the same page and understanding the pain that we each have to go through each day. Now, reflecting that, I think I had one more point that I wanted to bring up for discussion before we open up to Q&A, and that is really, what should an organization prioritize? I know we talked about developing a strategy. Should that be the very first starting point when you want to start that journey in measuring outcomes? What did you find? So Karen, in your research, Toby and David, in your experience, when there is nothing in place really, where there's no buy-in from staff, when there are very little resources, there's little training, where do you start?
I think I'll jump in because it's just an extension of what I was saying before, is that strategy for me is 100% a paramount starting point. That gives you an anchor to start, to hang the next stage of the journey on. It gives people a structure to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you're ultimately trying to achieve. So that once you get the buy-in and the support, and you can get quite interactive and get a lot of people involved in that strategy development, it can be quite a good team building, quite a good cultural element. But it ultimately sets that guiding light that your measurement's trying to do. And I think, strategy has to be the start. It has to be that shining light that your whole team, your organisation and your stakeholders can engage and connect with.
Great, thank you. So there you go. We have the strategy as the shining light. Karen?
I was just going to say that given this is about outcomes measurement on a shoestring, I'd back up what Toby's suggesting with the comment that to develop a strategy that's supportive of outcomes for your organisation isn't expensive. It's only an issue of putting the time in and the thinking in. It's not something that's going to cost a lot. And in my research, the organisations who were most able to undertake this journey in a way that felt really beneficial for the organisations were those where they had made outcomes awareness and understanding and eventually, developing a measurement practice key to their strategy. And the reason they did that was because they didn't want to be doing things that weren't of value for their mission. So it all ties back to a good strategy helps you achieve your mission. So, which is what we're all here for. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of you there. Being in your evaluation being in your strategy, the performance of your organisation as a whole, and evaluation is the bigger picture. Outcomes measurement is just one part of that. But starting with your strategy, developing a plan, if you can, and I definitely recommend doing a co-design process with as many of the members of your team as you possibly can. Doing that together, getting to that very first question, the most important question, why do you want to do this? Being really, getting your team to answer that question, not just you. I'm on board. I'm here. I'm running the place, but there are impacts on other people in the organisation, and they actually really need to know why we're doing this. What's in it for me? Why would I do this? Now, I could be here all day answering those questions, but it's not. Other people need to actually feel that buy-in and feel what that's about. And again, having that as front and center in your strategic plan, in your organizational strategic plan is very, very important, that performance and seeing evaluation as a really important part of your strategy as an organization, not just in outcomes measurement, but a whole range of other things leading to the high level performance of your organization.
I think with that, David, is, you just touched on it, is you can't expect or rely on outcomes measurement to be done by one person. This is about creating that culture and that awareness. So if you start with your strategy and you can understand what's important to your organization, there's, another little maxim is you measure what you treasure. People can understand why they're making those measurements because they can see what it's demonstrating, which they've bought into in that strategy. And hopefully, many hands make light work. Another one, we can get more people involved in that measurement approach across the organisation, because it's not a thing you do; it's a way of working. And More and more we're seeing funding bodies, philanthropy, government, whichever they may be, starting to tune in to social procurement policies. They're wanting to see that their funding recipients are able to demonstrate that they are driving a social impact and they are delivering social good that aligns back to their strategy. And the more that you can have good strategy, process and governance in place around how you're measuring, and again, to what Karen said, it can be low cost. You don't have to go and throw huge money at an evaluation and a governance approach to outcomes measurement.
I mean, you're absolutely right. People will just simply not invest in your organisation if they can't see that you can prove your outcomes. Evaluation is about proving that your things actually work, they make a difference, but more importantly, it's about improving, constant, continuous improvement of all of your functions and processes. So, I think it's important not to lose sight of that. That's not the be all and end all, that you're proving that your programs work, but it's about continually improving and seeing that as the key goal in your organisation.
And one of the things that I think has happened, picking up from what you've both said, is that there has been a shift away from expensive external evaluation consultants, which is what makes organisations in the social sector feel that they can't engage in this, to embedding it as part of the organisation, as part of where the organisation sees itself, as part of its DNA, as part of what everybody does. And once that happens, the costs come down. There've been a lot of very expensive evaluations or social impact, consultations undertaken for organisations. In the end, they tend to be time specific, they tend to be limited to the particular focus of that research. It is far more effective, from my mind personally, as someone who's worked all their life in this sector, but also from my research participants, it's far more effective to have that as something the organisation can do for itself. And I think that's what you were getting at, Toby, when you said it can't just be one role. It can't just be one external consultant study either.
Yeah. Look, I think we've heard so many great ideas in the last 20 minutes. I love the strategy, the shining light, measure what you treasure, co-design. I think we've got quite a few keywords in here that we can start writing down and kind of think about, well, how are we going to embed this in what we do? And this last bit of the discussion about making sure that this is not a one-off thing. This is not something that we pay big money for and then we'll see when again can we afford this, but rather it's something that becomes something that the organization does, what we do. I was going to ask each of you for some resources, but I'm quite aware of the time. So I know that at the end of the webinar, Rhonda will send everyone, all participants, an email with a few resources, and I'll ask you to have your input in there. And I would also like to announce now that with that email, there will be a link to a new outcomes measurement guide that is being released today by CSI. Is the Roadmap to Social Impact Assessment, a step-by-step guide to planning, measuring, and communicating social impact. And hopefully these resources will support you further to develop that internal capacity to get to that point where we all want to be, where we can measure the great work that we do. So I'll thank the panel now for the insightful tips and suggestions, and we're opening up to Q&A now, and I'll pass on to Rhonda for that, who will be facilitating.
Hi, everyone. For those that did not hear the introduction, my name is Rhonda Umetsis. I work in the communications team at CSI, and I look after our Impact 2021 webinar series. I'm going to get to the Q&A now. We've got loads of questions, and we actually asked guests who'd registered earlier on to submit questions before this webinar. And you can also ask questions now in the Q&A function, but we will give those earlier questions priority. A lot of them are very similar. There's a lot of themes coming through, so I'll combine some of them and we'll get to as many as we can. So just before I get to the Q&A, as Alana mentioned, we're launching the roadmap today. You can actually access that now at csi.edu.au. It's on the homepage. So very spotlighted, so you can have a look at it if you like, but I'll also put it in the follow-up email as a link as well, along with the recording and a few other resources. I also wanted to mention that CSI, we're in the process of organising a whole heap of other tools and resources, which I'm sure you're all going to find very useful. And they're all free. There's one in particular that's being developed for the community services sector, and then another tool which is around indicators, and that is for the broader for-purpose sector. So they will be launched soon, and we will let you know when that happens. Another thing, and lastly, before I get to the Q&A, is that our team at CSI UWA, they've been running 2-day outcomes measurement workshops since 2019. And they've been doing those all around Australia, but now they're doing them online. And the next one they're doing is on the 16th and 17th of November. It is a paid workshop, but we'll send you the details for those again in the email, but you can also go to our website to check that out now if you wish. Okay, Q&A, heaps of questions. A simple one first. David, a lot of people have asked if you could repeat the name of the book that you mentioned.
Oh, sorry, that's easy. Mark Friedman, Trying Hard is Not Good Enough. Good starting point.
Great, thank you very much for that. We'll also put that in the email as well. Okay, so the first question I wanted to ask, and we've talked about, we've had a great panel discussion about the importance of outcomes measurement and how we get leadership on board and get internal buy-in. A lot of questions that are coming through are around the how. Like, how do we actually do this when we don't have the budget, the know-how, the resources? So Awana, I'm actually going to ask you this question. If you could only invest your time and energy into one thing to support outcomes measurement in your work or organization, what would that one thing be?
Yeah. I think this is what I've been trying also to get the tips on from our panelists. Like, what is your experience? What is that one thing? I think my advice is also quite close to what they've discussed, to that strategy. So first, I suggest that you should understand really the problem that you are resolving. So invest that thinking time. It's not a software that you're going to buy, that you should buy. It's not a new measurement tool or anything. It's just that time to sit down with your key stakeholders, the key people that you're involved with, and think about it in a few ways. Like, what are you resolving? What's the problem that you're trying to resolve here? And you're going to find that there might not be agreement on what the problem is. Like that little thing, like, give me your problem statement. What is the problem you're resolving? And then based on that, have a look at how much of that problem you are resolving, your program is resolving. And you do that by developing that theory of change. So I think that's where you should start. Like, give me the problem statement, have the problem statement clear, have that program theory of change clear to understand how much of that problem you are resolving. And from there, the next step will be, well, let's see what is it that we can measure from this theory of change, from that change model at the bottom of the theory of change. And that's when we'll go into the next step onto, let's see where the next investment is.
Great, thank you, Awana. Karen, I thought I might ask you this one. Maybe perhaps from your research, you might have some insights. And it comes from a small grassroots community organisation. What solution for impact measurement could you suggest when you don't work directly with the recipient? One example is we provide disadvantaged children with community donated clothing and nursery items through a professional network of caseworkers and agencies, but we don't ever meet or hear from those families who receive them. We'd love to measure the impact this donation is having to reduce impacts of poverty, emotional burdens, etc. How would they go about doing that?
That's a really good question, Rhonda. And again, I think it comes down to this thinking and thinking about your theory of change as well. So with an organisation like that, you'd be asking yourself, what is it that I'm assuming handing these clothes to families is doing for them? What's the purpose of that? And in doing that, you start to get a sense of what your impact is, or what the outcome you're trying to achieve is, what the change is. And then from there, you go backwards and say, how is, and this is what a theory of change is about, how is me giving clothing to these families achieving that? So you look at what you're trying to achieve, and then you say, how is it achieving that? And then you ask yourself, how will I know when I'm there? How do I know when I've actually got there in terms of achieving that? Now, for some organisations, it's absolutely imperative that you talk to the people who are directly benefiting from your service. But there are a whole range of stakeholders across organisations. And in this particular case, vulnerable children are an important stakeholder, but it's not ethical to be evaluating the response to them of getting these clothes. So you have to ask yourself, who else can I ask about this? Are there caseworkers working with those families? Are there teachers? Are there other stakeholders working in those family lives? And I'd have to know more about the organisation to be able to explore those questions fully. This is just off the top of my head. But there will be other people who can allow the organisation to address the fundamental question, what are we trying to achieve, and how do we know that we've got there? Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would also like to add to that, to what Karen has said, because it is very important all that Karen said. And I think alongside with that, when you ask yourself, what are you achieving with that? What's important, and perhaps it will resonate with some, is that systems thinking. Well, there is this problem of not having clothes, and you are addressing this issue of clothes, but is that the problem itself, or is it that because they don't have the proper clothing, that leads to something else? Like they can't present themselves to an interview, they can't go to school, they can't participate in day-to-day life. So seeing the problem that you're resolving in its system and what else does it contribute to, what else does it lead to, will help you understand really what are the problems to which you help resolve.
I think a really simple question process to have on that is the 5 whys. So
yes.
Ask, why are we giving these children clothing? We're giving them so that they're clothed. Well, why are we making sure that they're clothed? So that they're warmer in winter and they don't get ill. Well, why are we making sure that? So you just keep digging and just keep scratching that surface, and you'll find that if you ask yourself the 5 whys, or you ask your program the 5 whys, it'll actually get you to a really deeper level of understanding of what it is truly that your program or organisation is trying to deliver on.
Yeah, and I actually undertook a social return on investment in a really similar program to that in this question, where the program beneficiaries, for want of a better word, were vulnerable children, and they obviously couldn't be part of the understanding of that social value. But there were other ways that we could achieve that, and that was through talking to other caseworkers as part of the network of working with those children, and through their teachers as well. So there's, there are other ways around it, that you can even do something as explicit as an SROI by having the beneficiary stakeholder voice and value included, but it's not necessarily ethical to engage with the kids in that way.
I think it's highly appropriate to have some contact with the beneficiary if they feel that they are happy to give feedback about what was the benefit. So, with this particular organisation, how much do we do? How many clothes are going out? How well did we do it? It looks like you're targeting the right people through a casework network. That's really great. But, is anyone better off? You don't absolutely know if anyone's better off in that, but asking the beneficiaries, whether it's the parents, not necessarily the children, but particularly the parents, and you'd have a theory about why you're doing this as your organisation. It's, testing that theory and seeing whether, in the end, are people grabbing these clothes and putting them in the bin on the way out of the caseworker's office, or what are they using it for? What's the benefit? What's the outcome there? And getting more insight into that will really help you to hone in on what your activities will be into the future.
Yeah, that's right.
David, I'll stick with you for the next question. What is the best way to engage frontline staff in change continuous improvement around outcomes measurement?
As I said earlier, it's engaging your team. You know, there's a few things here. We talked about getting your leadership involved, getting people on board. It's really about that journey of starting. And one of the really key questions, which I think asking early on is, what would happen if we didn't do this? What would happen if we don't measure our outcomes? What would happen if we don't evaluate and we don't communicate our outcomes to our stakeholders? What would happen then? How would our organisation be in the future? So it's highly likely that we'll either stand still or we might, you know, start to decline. Once you actually get that question answered, then people can start to think, oh, okay, that's one way of doing it. But I think Karen said it pretty well earlier, when once you start to measure outcomes and you can communicate that to the people who are working in your organisation, and they can see very concretely that the work that they are doing has great value and it is really helping people. And not just, you know, small thing, not just the satisfaction piece, but why it's helping them, you know, what the benefit actually is. And it's a direct result. You know, that's probably stretching it a bit. It's not always a direct result. We've got to be clear about the way we do outcome measurement on a shoestring is that it's a pretty decent indication is what we're looking for. It's not science. It's not a randomized controlled trial that we're conducting here. We're trying to get a really good indication or a reasonable indication that what we're doing is making a difference, and as often as possible in the words of the beneficiaries, so that they're telling us what the benefit is. But I think those two things are really important. What would happen if we didn't do it, and feeling that it's really a duty of not-for-profit organisations or any organisation to be transparent about how their programs are progressing. Most of us are funded by, or many of us are funded by governments or philanthropic organisations who really want to see that their dollars are being spent in the best possible way, and showing them the evidence of that, I think, is really important, and staff, you know, will come on board. But the co-design process I named earlier, when you're talking about the why are we doing this, bring them on board, help them to answer those questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, I'd also like to add, if that's okay, that staff should understand, frontline staff should understand that it is not about measuring their performance, but it is about the program. It is about understanding how much change we're creating. And if we're not creating, to understand why and how can we improve. It's about improvement. It's not about judgment and penalizing anyone.
I think that's the whole journey piece, is that you're going to iterate. You know, it's an iterative thing. You might iterate your programs because you're not getting your desired result. You might iterate your evaluation framework because it's not telling you what you need to do. So don't feel a resistance to starting because you don't have it perfect, but have a preparedness to evolve and change as you learn, because that's ultimately what this is about.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. We're all responsible for the outcomes of programs in our organisation. We're all responsible to help that individual, team, program to get better. And that's what the framework is about. So that's a really important point.
I'll just remind everyone, originally we were going to finish at 1 o'clock. Luckily we're not, because I've got 40 questions here. So we are going to extend to 1:30. It's obviously optional. If you can't attend, no problems. We'll send you the recording. But I just wanted to make everyone aware we're going for another 35 minutes. I will ask the panelists to just who I direct it to answer, because otherwise we're not going to get through these questions. I do have a lot and I want to give everyone a fair go. So I've got quite a specific question for you, Ioana, again. This is from a social enterprise. So I'm building an impact framework from scratch for my employer, who is a national recruitment company and social enterprise. I had hoped to adopt a log frame approach as our measurement framework. Our interaction with key beneficiary stakeholders, who are job seekers, averages 3 to 6 months, which limits our ability to measure some medium-term and long-term outcomes at the individual level. Is this feasible and appropriate to not measure long-term outcomes directly?
Yeah, this is an issue when when you don't have access to your data, basically. If your logic model is demonstrating that you should be really measuring outcomes, from those beneficiaries, from those unemployment beneficiaries, benefit receivers, sorry, and you can't get to them past the 6-month point. Perhaps if there are proxies, this is what I would suggest. If there are proxies that you can turn to, for example, by keeping contact with or by tracking their employment record, for example, or whether they return into the system. You would be able, if you have access to administrative data, to see when they return to the system to being on benefits rather than continuing in their employment. So if they reappear in the system, you would understand that they didn't achieve that long-term outcome. If they don't appear there, then they would they would have achieved that long-term outcome. So unfortunately, you measure what data is a limitation, and you do continue to the point where you can. You will have your hypothesis in place that if they made it to that certain point, some of them are likely to continue on to the long-term outcomes, and then you'd have to turn to alternative data solutions, to your alternative data sources, be it administrative or perhaps another stakeholder that could perhaps act as a proxy to the one that you can't reach.
Okay, thank you. That was quite specific. Karen, I will ask you this one. We've had a lot of questions around data collection. And in fact, one of the tools that CSI is launching may well be helping with that later on in the year. But I wanted to ask you about this because it might have come up in your research. So I'll ask you just one of the questions. How can a small, sorry, wrong one. I would like to know, for a small charity organisation, what are the easy and reliable data collect tools for measurement in the market? For a typical program, we will conduct a survey in SurveyMonkey, communication and financial records in database, and media connection via social media. So those are the things that they're measuring. How do I integrate this data to show social impact? Or what are the practical ways to collect data for a small charity with limited resources? How do they do it?
So I think that's possibly starting it backwards, because there's not really a sense in that kind of approach to data collection of knowing why you're collecting something. And that comes back to working out what your theory of change is. What are you actually trying to achieve with this? A client or a customer satisfaction survey is really rich data from a marketing perspective, and it's really rich data from a do our participants like our service perspective. But if that's the outcome that the organisation is trying to achieve, for example, that participants like our organisation, then it's valuable data and you can work with that. I guess my issue from both my research and my work in this area is, what are you trying to find out about your organisation? And from there, the indicators, how do you know when you're getting there, come up, and from there the measurements come up, and from there the data collection that you need to get those measurements come up. So it has to be started from that, I guess, higher order thinking about the organisation than from the data. Now, obviously people do client satisfaction surveys everywhere. They're really commonplace. Some funders require the results of that to come in. That people are collecting demographic data. They're collecting the subpopulations they might work with. They're collecting engagement data. All of those outputs are really useful, but they don't allow you to answer the question of impact. So you really have to start at that other end and ask yourself, what is it we're trying to achieve? What are the changes that we're trying to achieve? And then your data collection can come from there. I'm a really big fan of training frontline staff to ask those questions in their normal interactions with clients and record that in their case notes in a way that is easy to retrieve. So you can do that with Excel. You can do that with some of the other data collection apps or platforms that are around. So does that answer the question?
It does. There's tools out there, but we need to find obviously the right one that works.
But you can't do that until you've started at the other end, is my main point.
That is coming through very loudly, clearly, which is a great thing. It's really clear. I really love this next question. I don't quite know who to answer, so I'll let one of you jump in. First in gets the answer. I want to find out how we retrofit outcomes to a project or program. Ideally, they should be identified when the project is being planned, but that's not always possible. And that's been asked by a not-for-profit in the children's services area. Anyone?
Look, I'm happy to jump in, and I mean, you can start anywhere. Obviously, it's ideal to, again, go back to Karen's point, start with your theory of change, work out what your program is designed to achieve, all of those points, but you can always go back. There's no reason why you can't. If you're delivering a program or a set of programs, go back to the program. Find out what are the outcomes this program is designed to achieve. What are you expecting to happen? And go through that process again, and then start off and go, right, these are the 2 or 3 important things that we hope this program will achieve. Start to put together an outcomes, think about the questions you're wanting to ask. And again, going through those questions, how much do we do? How well are we doing it? Is anyone better off? But thinking about those, is anyone better off questions that you're going to ask to give you that the understanding of how your program's going from the point of view of the beneficiaries. So I guess if that's retrofitting, it's always harder to do it on the way back, because you may have, you're running a program which you may not necessarily know why you're running it if you haven't got those things in place at the beginning.
David, I'll stick with you. Now I'm moving on to some other questions. These ones relate to the CRM that you mentioned. So a lot of people would like to know how you started with that. Where did you start with your budget? But this particular one I'll read out to you. Any suggestions on where to start with an internal data capture system, i.e. a CRM, for those who currently use a variety of tools that have been selected mainly to make external funder reporting rather than internal universal data collection? We've already got a TOC and social impact framework. That's a good starting point.
Yes. Look, I mean, it's a massive journey, and if I had have known the journey that the Family Centre would have been on when we went to the market to try and find a system that would help us to collect data, to analyse that data, and to be able to track all of those things, I wouldn't have started on that journey, but we did, and we actually built our own small database CRM, which was great. And I'm not saying people should go out and do this, but it was enormously helpful. It was an incredible learning curve, but once it was in place and you're able to, it's not just about managing outcome data, it manages a whole range of data. You've got to have a place to collect your data and then being able to sort and manage and analyse. So important for any small organisation. Now, there's lots of places you can do that. For us, we did that. We ended up doing it in a much bigger way, and we've just come through our second iteration of Chorus, which is our social enterprise now. Other organisations in this industry use that platform. You can, if you're interested in that, go to our website and you'll see it across the top bar. Just press the button, Chorus. But look, I can't stress how important it is to have a system like that in place of some sort. You can again start very small, as long as you've got something that you're able to manage your data in. I think if you've got it coming out of coming back through Facebook or coming back through, sure, you're collecting data from everywhere, but you want to have a more structured approach where the data is coming into a central point and that you can see it clearly, and it helps you to understand what's happening out there, and then how you can continue to evaluate and how you can get better over time. So it's a really important thing to have. I'm not saying it's easy. It's certainly not an easy thing to do, but there are products out there I think the problem that we identified in the market as a social enterprise was that there aren't any really cheap options out there for smaller organisations, and that's a real issue. We're trying to develop a product which is a membership or a collective sort of basis where we all contribute and we all benefit from the ongoing upgrading of that product. So, Chorus is one way if you come together as a social enterprise and start to have members involved, and we try to drive that price down because we don't have a massive interest in profits like many of the other platforms that are around. I won't talk any more about Chorus.
Thank you, David. That's really useful. Awana, what do you think about measurement systems such as IRIS from GIN or CRI? Sorry, I did not say that. I don't know the terms, obviously.
Yeah, I have to be honest, I'm not very familiar with IRIS, but I do know a bit about SROI, the social return on investment. I think to some extent, SRI is very similar to the logic model approach in that you do think about inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and you do need to list everything that happens for everyone, what changes your program is responsible for. So up to here is the common ground. And then with SROI, the difference comes in that you need to allocate a dollar value to every single outcome that's results, and you can claim from your intervention. And you add something, you take away something. You add like how long will the outcome last, for how at what intensity will affect, how many people, and so forth. So the difference is, the thinking behind it, I think, is very similar. They're both, I would say that they're both based in theory-based evaluation. They come with that theory of change and the logic model behind them. But the SRI brings in the economic value. There are like an increasing number of instances that when SROIs are being requested, that people think that there is more value when you can actually demonstrate that ratio to say that for every dollar invested, there's $3, $4, $5, $6, $7, $20 of benefit coming back. But there is also a risk of those figures being misused. For example, if you compare an SROI return ratio in, say, housing with one in education with one in employment, those may be very different standards across sectors because, say, having a $2 return for every dollar invested in education might be nothing compared to having the same return in health, for example, or so they could be misused if they end up on the desk of someone who doesn't know how to use them. And also there are risks when you try to monetize everything. So think, for example, and this always sticks in my head, this example, because it came from the country where I was born, Romania, and there was an attempt to do an SROI on having children adopted. So there was this not-for-profit looking to take children from orphanages and placing them into care with families. And they got stuck at putting a dollar value to having a family, having the love of a family, because that was a key outcome for those children. And how do you put a dollar value to that? So they got stuck there, and fair enough, you could not monetize that. So you have to think about how much you can push with that monetary value and how much you want to claim before you can be challenged on those claims. There is a very thorough process to do it, and you do need to evidence everything that you claim, and it's a well-established framework of measurement. And if you're willing to do this and you know the risks, you know the benefits, I do recommend that this is something that you can consider.
Okay, thank you. This is one for all of you. Who's willing to share a good example of an organizational measurement strategy to share with the group? Do we have template samples we could send in our follow-up email?
I think I'll jump on that one. And the reason being is that, so the work at IRT Group, so we've got a team called Age Matters that supports homeless older people or people who are at risk of homelessness. And the reason why I'll use it is that as much as we've talked about systems and whatnot, I think you should also be prepared to go a bit old school and be a bit manual. So we've got people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. They don't have access to tech. You know, there's a lot of equity of access barriers around data capture and information. So to exactly the point before that I think David made is having frontline workers who are engaged and involved to capture that data and be able to report back on behalf of those beneficiaries. But also doing things like a paper survey with a stamped self-addressed envelope where people just fill it out and send it back. And, you know, picture the duck on the pond, you know, let it be easy for them. And if we've got to do a bit of extra hard work kicking those legs under the surface, I think that's something you should really consider. Because when you look at it from a measurement strategy, everything's got a link. And I think if you're new to this, it can be a bit unwieldy, it can be a bit sort of scary. But having that strategy document around what you're doing, what the programs are they're trying to achieve, how you're going to do it, and then having a consistent methodology, because, you know, longitudinal data adds more value the longer you can do it. So if you can get into a frequent and regular cycle and know that you're going to survey people on entry to your program, then a 6-month follow-up, and then put them into a 12-month rotation or regular follow-up after that, over time, you're going to end up with some really rich data, and you're going to be able to start pulling themes out of it. You're going to be able to start identifying when program changes happened or government policies changes happened or different life events have taken place. And I think an example from that for us is we use a personal wellbeing index, and that's another comment I'll use, is that if you can link your data capture from your clients back to a central or publicly available data set, and the Australian Centre for Quality of Life have that for the personal wellbeing index across different age groups. And I'm not saying that is the one you can use. It is one that we're using because it fits our purpose. But just for example's sake, you can actually start to measure how your programs are delivering an outcome or an impact for the cohort that you're working with against a standardized group of people within Australia. So we use the 65 plus age bracket from the personal wellbeing index, and that gives us a really almost sort of case control thing. So I think if you're looking at a measurement strategy, have those big headline things that we've talked around about why, but then have a very systematic process in terms of how you capture it, what you're doing to capture it, how regularly you're going to capture it, because it links back into Ioana's initial slide. That then gives you an opportunity to provide evaluation and to do an analysis and come up with recommendations around whether you need to shift programs or lobby for changes from government funding guidelines, because often, you know, a shift in funding guidelines means that your program becomes limited, can't do the same breadth. And that may actually have a negative impact on the beneficiaries that you're trying to help. So I think your strategy has to be end to end, and you have to know that process, as does your team, and you have to follow it very, very rigorously to make sure that the data you capture is good, the frequency in which you capture it's good, and the evaluation and analysis that you can pull out of it can drive further positive change from the work that you do.
Thanks, Toby. Just a reminder to guests, we are running until 1:30 today. We decided to add an extra 30 minutes to answer all these questions. We've had a good one come through, and Karen, I think this might be potentially for you. From Liz, does the panel have any comments, advice, experience on developing and measuring outcomes in partnership across services which undertake similar work with the same client groups? That's a great one. Have you ever come across that?
I have, because I've worked extensively in the domestic violence sector, and integrated and collaborative responses are very much a part of the work in that sector. So yeah, it can be really successful. One of the things that needs to happen is that there are some data sharing protocols and information sharing protocols, and that has to absolutely be done in a way that's ethical and preserves client confidentiality. But there are ways of doing that, and lots of domestic violence integrated responses have done that. There's also a whole bunch of stuff that Ioana would better be able to speak to around place-based responses to wicked social problems, or collaborative collective impact. So Ioana, you would know a bit more about that, because it's been one of the things that the Centre for Social Impact has really been advancing over the last 10 years.
Yes, that's right. But you know what? I think one of our another one of our panelists, David, has quite a bit of experience here.
Okay, David, go for it.
Look, I think this is a good place to. I mean, absolutely, we are dealing with really big adaptive challenges often in our work: poverty, income security, homelessness, domestic violence, child safety and development, mental health. They're really big challenges. They're massive challenges, and we can't, our individual programs are not going to make a huge dent in those big population changes that we're probably looking for in collective impact projects. Or so again, when you're measuring, we talk, I like to make the distinction between, I guess, program measurements, something that we can control as an organisation and get better at, and then the bigger picture, which is the population change or the impact we have in a population that we're working together to make a difference on. So let's say it's domestic violence, as you said, Karen. There's a lot of players who can come together, being able to identify what are those indicators that we're trying to make a difference with. What are the indicators we're trying to turn the curve? Reducing incidents of domestic violence. You can choose a whole range of things, but I think there are problems in terms of managing the data around that, coming together as a group, agreeing on what the problem is, having a shared agenda to move forward on that, and then being able to collaborate on collecting data, and more importantly, having access to the population data. So we don't always have good indicators that are available in a community to let us know whether domestic violence is reducing, or whether there are less children going into out-of-home care, or less issues around children being identified as coming into the childcare system. So all of those things are really important work, and I think that's the area that we're struggling with as an industry or as a sector, that we find that kind of collaboration on data and finding the key indicators that we're trying to turn the curve on, and bringing those together so that we can come together and say, we've collaborated on this, bringing down or reducing or increasing whatever it is that you're trying to reduce or increase in terms of a wicked social problem. But you could talk for days around that, but I think that's the holy grail of social impact. So I like to make the distinction between measuring outcomes in programs and long-term sustainable change in a community as impact. Making those long-term sustainable changes, seeing the number of Aboriginal children going into out-of-home care, for instance, in our region. If we can reduce that, and as Toby said, looking at the long term, looking at trend data over time, it starts here. You want to bring it down to here. How do you do that? Our organisation isn't responsible for that, but we contribute to it. And many organisations coming together, contributing to that, having access to that data is a good start, and then working together on programs that work. And it'll be a range of programs. It won't just be one program, it'll be a number of programs and other things.
Yes. That's amazing, David. Thank you so much for that. This is an interesting question. We did talk before about the need for outcomes measurement, particularly for funders, and needing to prove what we're doing. Someone has asked here, what would you say to an organisation that is scared to measure because they might lose their funding? Awana, what would you say? Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. That's a legitimate question. That's quite, that's interesting that could be.
So organisation would not measure because they are scared they might lose their funding.
Yeah.
I would say that they shouldn't be scared of that. They should actually see measurement as something that might increase their funding, not push the funding away. Usually measurement is something that funders want to see happen so that they know how their money is spent. If you're afraid that you're not achieving to expectations, I think there could be a few things happening there. One, you might be asked to report against standards that you don't really work towards. Say you might be asked to measure, I I don't know, say against NAPLAN, what you are, how your students, or they say if you're engaging with students, how their NAPLAN results improve, when in fact you're not really working to improve NAPLAN, but to improve, how they socialize and their social well-being. So, if you are being asked to report against measures that that your program is not achieving, then that is a problem. So you need to demonstrate that, hang on, I'm being asked to measure something that is actually not there because my program is not working towards this. So don't be afraid of measuring, but put your foot down about what you are actually doing and what you should be measuring. And the second point that I wanted to make, that if you are measuring and you're seeing that perhaps you're not achieving as you would be expecting, you have to ask yourself, why am I not achieving this? So it has to have that why next to what is happening. So you find out what's happening, and then you go on to look through other types of data collection. For example, you go to some interviews and talk to different stakeholders involved in this program to understand, well, why are we not achieving this? Is it that we are not delivering something that we should be delivering? Is it that we're not engaging in a way that we should be engaging such that we see these results happening? And this will result into an improvement in how you deliver a service, which will be something that your funder wants to see. So it is a matter of communicating with the funder and making it clear what you should be measuring, and depending on your findings, what you should do to make sure that that group that is in need of services is supported.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think I might ask Toby this one. How do we determine outcomes for single brief contact, so like a helpline? I just wondered if your organisation might have experience there. So the question continues, where service users may choose to remain anonymous. We collect a minimum data set and offer satisfaction surveys, and we report on both. But I feel we are not truly capturing the voice of our service users.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair question that we've probably all had experience with in different ways. And, you can't expect that everyone's going to be a repeat, service recipient or an ongoing service recipient. You also can't expect that everyone's going to want to participate in your data capture methodology if you're asking non-essential data, all right? So I think just put that out on the table. But back to some of the themes that's come through today, it's around people understanding the reason why. And a big part of that understanding is very much your beneficiaries, your service recipients. So I think that if you can understand your logic model and what you're trying to achieve, and we've touched on that a bit, that'll help fall out the questions and the data that you're wanting to ask. Now, if you can understand that, you can actually start to build a communications piece for those service recipients, which is around, we are organisation X, we know that we're only speaking to you once. We try to capture this data because did you know from the data we've captured or the data we're trying to capture, we will be able to achieve this. So would you be willing to assist us in sharing just a couple of anonymous, de-identified responses to these questions? Because we can't expect or assume that everyone is going to want to, or everyone's going to understand why we're asking for their input, because essentially it's personal information. And everyone needs to have that right to deny or accept. And I think that if you're going to expect people to accept you asking those questions, they need to understand why. And that comms piece around the why has come out, I think, fairly strongly today. Starting at your strategy, your change, your measurement strategy, then you can build out communications. Because I think probably one piece we haven't drilled into a whole lot today is around the importance of communicating your outcomes to the different stakeholders that you're working with. It's not just around funding. Like I know that, for example, Perpetual have a fantastic impact philanthropy round, and they really drill in onto your governance and whatnot, and they have a reason why they ask it. But they don't help you sell your message. They're a fantastic philanthropic body that, I recommend everyone have a look at them because, they do just cover quite a diverse range of areas in terms of service providers. But that's got no relevance to your service recipient, to the homeless older people that we've helped at IRT Group. They don't give a tinker's cuss whether it was philanthropy through Perpetual or a government body that helped us get a roof over their head. They need to understand that, guys, we see more people And this is where central data sets plus your own measurement comes in place. We know that men and women over the age of 85 are the fastest growing cohort of homelessness in the country. That's a known fact. We know that from the services we've provided through the responses that people have given us, our services as IRT's Age Matters has made this change, or it has delivered this impact, or the quality of life measurements that are reported to us through our ongoing have shifted by X% year on year. And that's the message and the communication that you need to be able to share with your stakeholders to either understand why they should accept your services and why they should respond to your questions, but obviously have secondary benefits back to funders.
The importance of a good comms experts coming through too.
Can I just add to that? Toby? I think, and Rhonda?
Yes.
From my research, that's the one area that really needs to be built on with organisations, this notion of transparency, even where there's good accountability and there's good, what's called upward accountability to the funders, being transparent about the outcomes to the people who are using your service and having those outcomes, as David suggested, co-designed by people who use those services is, I think, the next phase of where the non-profit sector needs to be working. And you start with your annual reports. There are very few annual reports that actually allow outcomes measurement to be publicly and transparently accessed, in public-facing documentation, but also with particular service users where there might be literacy levels variations, there might be a whole range of stuff, including people like Toby's working with, that comms needs to be done in a way that is equitable and accessible too. So that becomes another strategy of, I guess, yeah. So I just wanted to add, I agree with what you're saying, Toby. It's the next frontier.
The new frontier, love it. Moana, one for you, quite specific again from Renee. Do you recommend an organisation-wide theory of change where there are many programs and funders across health, community services and family services? Or would you develop a theory of change program logics at a program or service level only? Oh, she's frozen.
I can take that. We've just been grappling with this question just
that's
recently.
Great. Thank you.
Look, I think you could do it both ways, but we've adopted to try and do a theory of change across the entire organisation. We have a number of programs across the entire organisation, but also, you could do it for each program, but having your logic model is probably the thing that's more important for each program. We also have a logic model for our entire organisation. So, it's a bit of both. I don't think there's any rules around it. I think you need to grapple with it in terms of your own organisation. But I certainly think a theory of change, when you're delivering many, many different programs in many different areas, a theory of change across your organisation is pretty important. And the logic model only is just a good, diagram of what it looks like in your organisation, from problem to impact and everything in between. And you can see that quite clearly for your stakeholders who know, oh, what are we doing? How are we getting from these problems to the impact we're trying to achieve? Sorry, I'll pass back to Iwana.
Yeah, sorry. I think, yes, everything froze for a moment there, but I think I understood the question, as I think I froze towards the end, having an overarching theory of change or program level theory of change logic model, yes. And I've heard part of David's response, and I would add that what we see most often, and it becomes useful to organizations, is to have an overarching theory of change. We see organizations having programs in different areas. So if working on different pillars, so organizing your programs in such they make sense, how they all build into that one theory of change, so that you can demonstrate how all your work builds up to deliver your mission and to achieve the vision of your organization. And then for each program, you may have a program level theory of change and that logic model, so that you understand what are the inputs that's going there, what activities you need for each, and the outcomes, and then overarching impact.
Yes, which is covered in the roadmap that we've just launched today, coincidentally. I'm going to finish off with one question, which I'll get you all to answer in just a couple of words, like one sentence, just 2 words. If you had 2 hours a week to work on outcomes measurement, what would you work on? Awana, I'll start with you.
Presumably you wouldn't work on the same thing each week.
No. What would you focus on? Yeah.
I would say first focus on your system and understand where you operate and why you operate and what you're trying to achieve and how you fit with everyone else around you. Because once you understand that, you'll move on.
Okay. Next, Karen.
I confirm what Joanna said, that start off working out why you're doing what you're trying to do, and then move as you get onto that to looking at your data to see whether you're actually achieving it. There's no point collecting the data if you don't analyze it and if you don't use it to change what you're doing.
David.
Look, I'm struggling. That's a really good question. I really don't know we're so immersed in it, but probably the one thing I would want to work on more is communicating our impact and outcomes, or at least communicating our outcomes across our organisation to all of our stakeholders. I think that's a really important thing that we're probably not doing enough on, and I'd love to spend more time on that.
Great. Toby, you have the last word.
And I promise this isn't a non-answer, but I think we are all in very different stages of the journey around outcomes measurement. So if I was spending 2 hours a week, it would be developing my plan, reviewing my plan, and acting on my plan. Now, obviously, that's very different depending where you are, Anna. And that's why I think constantly reviewing and acting on it and communicating that with your stakeholders. Because if you're just starting out, I think to build trust in people getting involved, it's really important to explain the story of why you're going into outcomes measurement. And that will, over time, build trust and contribution, ideally, back into any of the measurement you're trying to do.
Thank you. That is amazing. We've probably got through around half of the questions, so we could have gone on for hours, but we will have to finish it up here. I would like to thank all of our panelists. I've really enjoyed this webinar. It's been super interesting. I've learned a lot. I always do in every webinar, and I'm sure our guests have too. And in fact, some of them have used the Q&A to thank us and say they're really looking forward to the follow-up email, which I will send in a few days, by Monday, probably at the latest. I really encourage you to check out the roadmap we're launching today and stay tuned for the extra tools and resources that CSI is launching. We've been working really hard on them. And I also encourage you all to visit impact2021.online for future webinars, which we run monthly. Thanks again, panelists. And yeah, we'll be in touch soon. Bye for now. See ya.